And we're live. Okay, so this should be the final session, video, live stream, broadcast, whatever, on the UV mapping, the turkey, leftover turkey. So in the previous sessions, which I shall link to in chat, copy, paste, copy, paste. Essentially, we just went over the fact that even though this robot turkey is made from some relatively simple shapes, how you unwrap it isn't always as straightforward as one might think. Because we have to take into consideration all sorts of things in relation to how the textures appear on the object. So the UV mapping itself on its own is not really the thing that you are concerned about, so much as making sure that the UV maps unwrap the object relative to how you want the texture to appear. So in the previous video we discussed, so let me select so we've selected the body. We discussed one of the main issues that we had with the body was how we were going to unwrap the side, well, the front, back and sides, because there's a degree of overlap with the front and back, but the sides don't. So in the previous video, let me see if I can just load up the file. 13? No, 12. So deselect that, select the body, whoops. So previously, the UVs were unwrapped relative to fitting the width of the UV within the texture space, which gives us a section and running along the top and on the bottom that's missing. Because of the simplicity of this particular texture, which is just a simulated cartoon style metal panel, what we can do with this is, instead of necessarily unwrapping so that we are still so the UVs are in proportion, so the height is in proportion relative to the width, so the center face, which is deselected here, the center face is actually square, but overall it's slightly elongated because of the two side panels. These two. But because of this particular type of texture, because of its simple nature, what we can do is stretch it. Right, so that's the S key and then the Y key. Stretch it vertically so that it fits within the bounds of the image. So we fit the entire thing to the UV, and because of its simplicity, we don't show, or there is very little noticeable texture stretching. So that means that when we go on to do the side panels, we can do the same again. We can remap those so that they occupy the entire UV. So we now have the corners mapped to the corner of the texture. That should be, whoops, that should be that top corner, which it's not, so that means we have to orientate. So which corner is that? So we have to flip this, rotate it. This is 1, 2, whoop, 2. If you hold the control key down whilst you're rotating, that makes it easier to rotate to fixed increments. So that should now mean that this corner, yeah, is there, is where it needs to be. So mapping this way, it now means that we've got the entire texture applied to this one single UV for this individual face, but for the others it's mapped across the set or the group. So let's select that one, redo that, which will likely flip the rotation again. Oh no, it hasn't. Has it? Nope, that's okay. And then we do the same as we did with the front for the back. So this fits within the width but not the height. So if we select the selection, select the island, which is that button, S, Y, Control or Control Shift to have smaller increment snaps, and then fit that. We've gone over a little bit, so adjust that. And that fits the back side. And the same with the top. What we'd need to do with this as well is that fits within the texture bounds. Yep, so that's okay, and that's okay. But what we've got here that we need to take care of is that we can fudge the UV alignment here slightly by selecting individual vertexes or vertices. So which face are we on? So that will probably be this top face. That's on that side. So we'll do it with that side rather than flipping the texture. But what we can do is select the vertex and we can shift the UV so that we fit the brown edge. We fit that to the alignment of the UVs so we don't get that colour drop off on missing face. So is that should be the other side, because the alignment of the UV cuts across the bright area of the pixels, the image pixels, so we can adjust that so that we get the dark area which continues this edge, this shadow edge or hard edge, this cartoon edge around. And we don't necessarily need to look at this in the 3D view, but we know what we're kind of doing now. So do that to all of them. And then you do the same for the bottom. And repeat that for the head. And yes, and just the head. And that essentially means that you have better alignment of the UVs relative to the texture. So you don't always have to rely on the way that the UVs are specifically unwrapped when you unwrap them initially using the Unwrap tool. You can play around with the alignment or shape and fudge them to get them to do what you need them to do relative to a texture. But one of the really tricky parts previously was the wings. And for this, although it's still showing the new UV map, which we'll get onto in a second. The original UV that we did just basically placed the front, that's the front UV section over the back. But the trouble with that is that it doesn't allow for too much customization. The new image that was the original image, if I remember correctly, was just square. Was it square? I can't remember if it was square. But the problem with that is that it doesn't allow you too much customization. So which wing are we on? That must be the back side. Yeah, so that's the back. Now, because the back isn't seen, or it's not as clearly seen, clearly visible in imvu, what you can do is shrink it down so that it uses up less space on the UV, and position it somewhere where you can give it a specific area or dedicate a specific area in the image to the UV, and that allows you or frees up the, which way around is that? Right, so for the eventual UV it was flipped, so it's essentially upside down now, but its orientation allows better space usage with the back side offset to one side. So that now means that you can place unique colouring on one side, unique colouring on the other side, and the same for the edges. So the edge was split because it's a very long section of UV. If it's left in its default state, it's an extremely long piece of UV, which makes it difficult to place on a texture. So what you can do, which we did, is break up the back from the overall main body of that section, and again positioning this in a place on the texture where you can facilitate custom coloring or custom tinting. So as you can see here, what you end up with is you can approximate or simulate shading. So because of the front of the wing, well, the side, this bit, because that's facing outwards, it's prone to more light, whereas the edge isn't, and the back obviously less. So you can use different colours to simulate or indicate shading. And do that for both wings. And that allows for better, whoops, and more complete customization of the wing. And again, that's going to be, so that one can move over there, and that one can be moved down here as well. And then we do the back. Shrink that down. So this is fitting this into the space that's been set up for the version that was visible when the stream first went live. But this texture was built based on the UV. So the UVs for the wings were corrected and laid out like this first. This is just a rough version. They were laid out like this first. The map was then exported. So once you've got your UVs laid out from the UV image editor, which is this half of the screen, left half, UV image editor, UVs, and then export. And what you might want to do, or what you might find useful, is that when you are setting up your UVs, is to, when you save them, it'll use by default the file name, so you'll have to give them a unique, so this would be wings, and then make sure you know what the image is, so give it a UV append if you want, and then do a version save, because you will likely do several versions of the same thing, trying to make adjustments to the UVs so that you get as much texture usage as you possibly can from the UVs that you lay out. So that will mean that you'll have a version of this texture that you can compare to something else that you've done previously. And then save the file and use this as your template. So if I drop, this is Coral Photo Paint, an older version. Where are the wings? Oh, could have sworn I had different versions. But that's the final UV that was set up, and you can see how that relates to the UVs. This is just rough and approximate, but when I open the final version, you'll see that the correlation between the image and the UVs. But taking into consideration what we've just been talking about, if you split up the UVs like this, it then allows you to do a bit more customization in terms of what you want painted on the image. But it does take often some trial and error to try and get that right. And it's the same with all the elements. So this was the initial rough UV done for the tail, but the final version, I'll open the image instead this time. So the final version of the tail, this is the UV that was done. And the final image, as that relates to the tail, allows for simple color placement. So if I show the UV layout over the top, this is what we have. So if you break the UV into sections and lay it out as neatly as you can, it allows you to be able to paint different areas of it, of the texture, relatively simply. It makes it much more straightforward to do. So what I'll do now then is, so that's the rough UV that we did for the tail before we finished. That's the rough UV that was done for the beak, and that's changed, as you can probably see underneath with the image. This dark line here is now the top of the beak, repositioned and used as a guide to create the image. That's the bottom of the beak, and then the whatever those things are called, that fits in the top. And we've also got a couple of extra elements which are some nuts and bolts. that were added to the scene to act as the hinge of the jaw. Same with the eyes. Although this time, rather than using the entire size of the image for the front of the eye was shrunk slightly and placed so that it's centered on that iris, which provides room for, let me see if I can, which provides room for the edge of the eye, which we can tint. So that gives us a little bit of shading using a relatively simple technique. So we've split the UV, or used the fact that it's split the UV into a front face, which is where the eye is, and then the outer rim that we can now shade. So it makes the eye slightly more, well, less flat, because we can add the shading. And then once you've done one eye, as was mentioned before, instead of doing the other one, that is, unless you want the eyes to be different, so you could use the same image, but you can make the turkey cross-eyed. And depending on the size of the cross-eye, to give yourself more room, you could decrease the size of the eye segment, the front of the eye, but if that will increase the size of the iris, so you might have to compensate for that. But you can make the turkey cross-eyed, or looking in front of it. And the same for the feet. So that was the original rough layout, and what was done was the leg, or the yes, so that's the main leg split into its own section, and then the top, sides and bottom were their own elements, and those have been positioned relative to the colouring of the UVs, of the texture. And so what that does is it provides us some very basic tinting. So we have a lighter colour at the top, darker colour at the sides and underneath, to give us a slightly more three-dimensional appearance. So note, one of the things that you might want to notice actually is let's go into the body. So if I select all the faces that are UV mapped for the torso, uses the same image. So each section is UV mapped to the same image. So it's this mustard coloured thing. Same with the rivets, although I think we gave those another material, a separate material. So the problem with this, that although we've been efficient with our use of UVs, so we've mapped one image to the entire object But in doing that, it's left us with something that looks quite flat. So it's uniformly coloured all the way around. So a cheat or a quick way to sort of fix this or address this problem is to use vertex colouring. So you are being efficient with your assignments, texture assignments, but to add variety, you can use vertex colouring. So let's switch back to default. You might want to switch, so it's wireframe is enabled, and you want to enable draw all edges so that you can see everything. So select your object, press the V key, V for Victor, or from the mode selector, just select Vertex Paint, and you'll get the pop-up control. So what you want to do is change the color of, so that's left click, either the selector indicator or just left click drag, and the same for the saturation. And then once you've got a color selected, just left click one of the vertices and it'll tint the object. So let's do a slightly less intense one for the back. And you can go around the entire object, and even though there is just one texture assigned, it's even less for the sides. Even though there is only one texture UV mapped to the entire object, we can create the illusion that there are more assigned by using vertex colors. So now we've created something. Press the V key to cancel, to exit Vertex Paint mode, but we've now created the illusion of depth and shading using vertex colors. And this saves on having to do or having to unwrap the cube in a very different way if you want to provide control over, because you'd basically have to unwrap it like a cube, which would then uses less texture space but allows so if I just press the so why isn't it doing that? So let me just double check that. But this requires you to place seams around the object so that it unwraps relative to how you actually want it to. E. Yeah, so you can, in fact, actually what you can do, or what you could do, but you're starting to increase the size of the project. So if you want each side to be customizable completely, you would have to unwrap it so that either each side occupies an individual section of the image that you are mapping to the object, or you'd have to create a material, texture, and image assignment for each side. So each of these would be on their own material. So let's switch back to, and just, so to what you could do, material, body, we want to create a new assignment here. So switch out of object mode, edit mode, click the numerical button. That's 16 instances of this. Click that, creates a new unique one. Body 2. And then what we can do is create a new... Oh, that's right, it's assigned it to the object, not the face. So we want body. With that selected, click plus, assign, want body 2, and we can change the material color for this to highlight that. But that's a secondary material assigned to the object, and you can go around the mesh assigning, so it's a cube, so that's six different materials, 6 different textures, and 6 different image assignments. So you'd have to create a lot of images in order to do a fully customizable mesh. So again, how you unwrap the object depends on how you want it to be textured. But overall, once you've got everything set up, 14, what you end up with is your fully textured, well, turkey in this instance, but how you, that's it. So this is what we mean in terms of redistributing the UVs to get as much space used as possible that allows you to do as much customization as possible. And again, you can either, depending again how you unwrap the object, you can change the colors and tinting by actually doing it within the image. So we've got the nuts and bolts, the hinge of the beak, or the pivot point of the beak. That's actually painted onto the texture as a different color. But the turkey's head is tinted, and the turkey's body is tinted with Vertex painting. So it's the same image. So that's all the UVs assigned to that one image, but we've used Vertex painting to tint the mesh to add some variety and depth. And that's how you can essentially, well, that's how you use UVs relative to the textures, and then however many textures you want, or however many you want relative to how easy you want the object to be derivable, if it's a derivable object other people are going to use, or whether it's just for yourself. And again, the rivets. So the vertex colouring comes in handy with the rivets in particular, because they have, as a set of 4, they have their own, it's a 64 by 64, so it's actually quite small. That's how big it is in actual size. That's the home key. So if you press the home key on your keyboard, it reverts to the actual size of the image. So we've got all the rivets mapped to the same texture, but they're tinted slightly different colours, again using Vertex painting, which we can see if activate. So without Vertex colouring, they'll be white. So if I just paint this to clear this one of colour, they're white by default, but they can be tinted with Vertex colouring. So again, same principle. Everything's mapped to the same image, each of them, They're all mapped to the same image, but tinted using vertex colors. And same with the feet. So with the feet, as we were saying previously, we've split the texture, kept it simple, a lighter colour at the top, darker colour at the bottom, and then used the UVs to sort out the placement of the colour. And then in this instance, just done an extra bit of vertex colouring to darken the very bottom, and add a little bit of tinting around the top of the leg so that we don't get what you end up with if you don't do that is a very bright connection where there should really be something that's shaded. Hold on a second. Well, hey, the joys of phone calls during live streaming. Had to mute that. Sorry about that. So yes, as we were saying, you want to use your vertex colors as much as you can to avoid or to add depth and to avoid issues where you have things like this, where you've got something that should be shaded is showing up full bright relative to the shading that you would expect. So use your vertex colors for that. Or you could assign that within the textures that you've got, but obviously that then depends on the amount of space that you've allowed yourself with the UVs. So again, we're back to the UVs in terms of what it is that you're actually trying to achieve with the texturing, informing how you unwrap the object's UVs. So let me reload this. 14. And that's the robot turkey. It's essentially done. Took a bit of doing, even though, as mentioned at the beginning of the stream, it's a relatively simple object. The difficulty with the UVs isn't the UVs per se, it is how you use the UVs relative to the texturing that you want to do, and how easy you want that to be for other people if the objects are derivable. So that essentially, so that's three videos, just on UV unwrapping a simple character. So we've got one on making, 3 on discussing the UVs, and then the final one, or the next one, will hopefully be creating a simple animation for this, an animated furniture item with seating for imvu, which will then be exported via FBX and imported into create mode. So this was a quickie, relatively speaking, just to update on the final. Oh, actually, I suppose. So talking about images, might as well. So these are the final images. Actually, this might be an interesting segue here to talk about right. So this will just be a quick overview of the textures. Right, so this one here, this is the body texture, and this, well, in Photo Paint, it has a number of layers, but the layers are really just for the darker outline edges and some of the other sort of visual interest features. But what's important about this one is that it acts as your primary color sample, if you like, for the rest of the object. So this is the main body. The same color is used for the head as it is for the rivets, as it is for the tail and the wings. Not so much the that's the beak and the feet, but what you can do is, once you've got your base color, so this color is essentially applied to all the other textures, and then what you can do is use different overlays. So in your image editor of choice, you'll have an option to change the style, not the style, the effect, or the way that the image overlays on top of your base color, which allows you to darken or lighten the color relative to the base, what's underneath it, which is this one. So if I just disable that for now. You don't have to be exact, but it helps that if you are so you can notice that there's a slight tint variation there. But what this does is that if your base layer is this body color from the get-go, it basically means that all the other textures that you create are tonally starting from the same base image, which means that you're more likely to get a consistent tonal range across all the images that are assigned to the object. So that's something to keep in mind when you are doing your texturing. And they're all relatively small textures. And essentially the wings, 2, as in TWO, or the number 2, 256 by 256 images, just because it's a 512, but the UV, as we were discussing, is mapped to a left and a right. But again, that's the base color of that is the same as the body. So that's just another quick tip for when you're texturing or creating the textures for your objects always start from the same base color for all the elements so that you have a consistency across the images that you're using. And on that note, we shall call it quits until the next session, which should be animating the object.